Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see so many people here. It's slightly intimidating because a lot of faces I recognize, but there are other faces I don't necessarily recognize, and I'm worried that you might know more about the subject than I do. But I'll try and illuminate things for you. I should just correct two things that Anthea said. My first acquaintance with Wolverhampton was in 1967 when I was just about to take my A-levels, and I came up on the train from Northamptonshire and was offered a place in the business school to do a business studies degree, sandwich business studies degree, but it was recommended that I improve my mathematics. Well, here I am as a professor. Either my mathematics has improved or the business school's reputation has gone down somewhat. You can judge that. The other is that I'm only 50% responsible for the link with two men, and it is a matter of great bitterness to me because in 1989, I think it was, we had a number of Russians here, one of whom was from Tyumen, and at that point, the university wasn't particularly interested in Russia and didn't seem to appreciate that Tyumen was the center of the oil industry. Within a year, Russia had, or the Soviet Union had broken up, and they realized that it was quite lucrative to have links with Tyumen University. In the meantime, I had given one of the people from Tyumen University, I think it was about £20 to go down on the train to London to have some connections with the British Council established, as a result of which these old things developed, and I still haven't had my £20 back from the university. However, what I want to talk to you about today is not the injustice of working at the University of Wolverhampton. There is a book coming out that you might have seen, which is actually a much more flattering account of what we do and what we try to do. But what I want to talk to you about is the way in which the world economy works, or really to give you some ideas about the way in which the world economy works and to try and provoke you. And the way I want to try and provoke you, as if you looked at the title, is talking a little bit about something like this. This is an apple. Now, apples come in all shapes and sizes. I brought two along. This one will figure a little bit later. There might be apple experts amongst you who, if you know what kind of apple that is, it's very, very important. But this apple is the one that I want to begin with. Now, I'm not sure how far you can see at the back. You probably think this apple looks very nice. But if I take my knife and cut the apple down the middle, you can possibly see that there are some things going badly wrong with this apple. It's beginning to rot a little. Now, there are bits of the apple that is still good, but there are bits of the apple that is a little bit more rotten. And part of my story is about the way in which apples of a particular kind operate in the world economy. And I'm going to tell you a story about an iconic company called Apple, an iconic chief executive officer called Steve Jobs. But I'm also going to tell it in a particular way, hoping to interest you and to provoke you to think a little bit about the way in which the stories that we are told about what happens in the world economy develop in particular ways. And sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that get the least attention. And the least interesting stories are the stories that get most attention. The difficulty is that the university, being a cheapskate organization, won't necessarily send me around the world to investigate these stories firsthand. So I'm going to have to employ a fictional device, which might seem a little bit strange, but as Anthea says, my journey in the university has taken me through various routes. So bringing a little bit of fiction and bringing a little bit of the approach of fiction writers into the university might not necessarily be a bad idea, and bringing it into the business school. And my piece of fiction is inspired by a Japanese film that some of you might have heard of, but others of you might find an interesting thing to follow up. It's a film by one of the greatest Japanese filmmakers called Akira Kurosawa. Now, if you've not heard of him, you've probably heard or possibly heard of one of his greatest films called The Seven Samurai. And The Seven Samurai was a film about how these medieval samurai knights in Japan protected a group of villagers from bandits. And it later became remade in Hollywood as one of the great films of all time, The Magnificent Seven. Essentially, it's a remake of Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Before that, he'd made his own version of Macbeth, but his first really interesting film was a very famous one called Rashomon. And Rashomon is the story of a murder told through the eyes of several people who witnessed the murder. You never actually see the murder itself. All you see are the people who tell you different parts of the story. Now, in the way that filmmakers often do, Kurosawa didn't have this idea himself. He borrowed it from a Japanese writer of the 1920s. And his film, Rashomon, is really a putting together of two short stories. The first short story, which gives the title to the film, Rashomon, is not actually about the murder at all. Rashomon is a gate in medieval Kyoto in Japan, which is suffering as a result of war, earthquakes, and so on, and it's a dilapidated gate. And in that story, in the pouring rain, things happen. And what Kurosawa did was to take the Rashomon story about the gate for the setting and then add to it a second story called In the Grove, and it's in that second story we find the account of the murder told through the eyes of different witnesses. And what I'm going to try and do today in terms of a business story is to bring forth a number of different witnesses that will talk a little bit about their views on the way in which certain companies and the world economy works, and what we know about that and what we don't know about that. So here we have, and it's a still from the film, the Rashomon Gate. And you'll remember I said that the circumstances were that the witnesses arrive in the pouring rain. The magic of technology. What witnesses have we got? Well, our first witness is a business school professor, a business journalist, a business writer. Our second witness is rather different. Our second witness is a young child from Africa and a young woman looking very tired from China. They're a little bit puzzled as to why they've been summoned to the Rashomon Gate, but nevertheless they're here to tell us their story. Our third witness comes from a more prosperous part of the world, and you can see here he's a tax justice protester, somebody who dislikes the way in which multinational companies avoid paying taxation. Our fourth witness is a bit more anonymous. He's a computer hacker. Our fourth witness is somebody who believes in the virtues of the computer revolution, believes that we are in a digital age, but is horrified by the way in which that age is being misused, and as our computer hacker sees it being taken away from realizing its real potential. We have a fifth witness, a fifth and final witness, and our fifth and final witness will be the CEO of Apple, a man by the name of Steve Jobs. There is a problem. Steve Jobs died in 2011. But do not worry. One of the legacies that Steve Jobs left us with was the magnificent thing that some of you have in your pockets called an iPhone. And if you have an iPhone, you'll know on your iPhone that you have a choice of having over 500,000 different apps. And amongst those many apps on your iPhone, there are an interesting selection of psychic apps in which you can contact this universal psychic guild, you can contact mediums, and through these mediums and these psychic apps, you can hear the voices of people who have gone before you. And maybe magically, through the app that Steve Jobs has left us with, we'll be able to hear from Steve Jobs himself about the way, nearly a year and a half after his death, he now reflects from the position up there, or down there, exactly on what his contribution has been to the world since the 1970s. Now, these are our five witnesses, and they're each going to give us an insight, I think, into different aspects of the way in which a company operates, the way in which a chief executive operates, but also the way in which the world economy operates. So let's call our first witness to the Rashomon Gate. Here he is. In this instance, it doesn't have to be a fictional witness because we have him here. His name is Walter Isaacson. And Walter Isaacson is one of America's top journalists, top business journalists. And he was the man who was asked to produce the biography of Steve Jobs as Steve Jobs realized and his family realized that he might not live for very long. And Isaacson's biography came out a couple of weeks after Steve Jobs died, and it became an instant bestseller. 600 pages. Length is very important. There are other books here. You might have seen this one. You can buy it in Smith's. It's much cheaper. It's much easier to read, by Karen Blumenthal. Steve Jobs, the man who thought different. Already translated into a number of different languages. All of these books tell us essentially the same story. And the story is the one that Isaacson sets out in the quotation that is there. Steve Jobs' saga is the entrepreneurial creation myth writ large. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple in his parents' garage in 1976, was ousted in 1985, returned to rescue it from near bankruptcy in 1997, and by the time he died in October 2011, Jobs had built it into the most valuable company in the world. Along the way, he helped transform 7 industries: personal computing, animated movies. He was responsible for Toy Story and everything that followed from that, music, phones, tablet computing, retail stores, and digital publishing. He thus belongs on the pantheon of America's great innovators, along with Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Walt Disney. None of these men was a saint, but long after their personalities are forgotten, history will remember how they applied imagination to technology and business. Now that summarizes people's view of Jobs in terms of the business school, I guess, in terms of the business press, and also in terms of many people's own appreciation of the man and the company. When Jobs died, Apple set up a sort of a memorial page, and over 1 million people signed it. It was almost like a Princess Diana movement in the world of technology. People were genuinely moved by the fact that this guy, Steve Jobs, had died. And maybe we can just do a little test to see why that might be so. How many of you have got an iPad? Stick your hand up if you've got an iPad. How many of you have used an Apple Mac in any form? How many of you got an iPhone? How many of you got an iPod? Is there anybody here who hasn't stuck their hand up? Whoa! Right, well, these are not the good people to rob on the way back. These are the people who are living in the 20th century. We're in the 21st century. There are, of course, resistors. We won't call them conscientious objectors. But in the last 20 to 30 years, enormous numbers of people have got swept up in the Apple phenomena, swept up in the Steve Jobs phenomena. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. These figures are not necessarily easily available. But I reckon that over the last 30 years, for a world which has a population today of some 7 billion, Apple must have been responsible for the production of at least 2 billion and possibly up to 3 billion different gadgets of one kind or another. That's just one company. Now, obviously, one gadget might replace another gadget, but that gives you an idea of the volume of what we're talking about. Apple at the moment is churning out something between 100 and 200 million items a year, so it doesn't take long for them to accumulate a very large impact in terms of what people have in their lives, what people have in their possessions. So it doesn't take much to see why Apple and Jobs should be so important. It is, in a sense, the iconic company. And it is the company that people can write short books about, but they can also write 600-page books about. And you would hope in the 600-page book, you would find all the stories that I want to tell you tonight. Because if somebody writes a book that thick, then there ought to be at least a reference to all of the different angles. And that's my problem. Because when we actually call some other witnesses to our Rashomon gate, what is striking is how absent they are. If I look, for example, for the word Africa in Isaacson's biography, it's not there. If I look for the word China, I can find 4 or 5 small references. If I look in Blumenthal's, there's not even a reference to China. Now, some of you might guess why China's important. In fact, you probably all know, because every Apple item you've got says made in China. So you might think it a little bit of an omission that a product that is made in China, produced by Apple and Steve Jobs, China gets such a poor mention in that. But Africa. Let's start with our young African child and the woman. What are they saying? Well, this is my imagined version of their testimony, and they're puzzled as to why they're here. Why have we been brought here? You have not noticed us much before. There's no space for us in your books. No space in the stories of your heroes for our countries, for our lives, for our work. Do you know what we do? Do you know how we do it? Do you have any idea how many we are? Look carefully as you turn on the gadgets that you value so much, because we are in them. They are part of us, and we are part of them. When you start to produce something, you start with materials that are in the ground. You can read books that tell you that we're living in a world in which you can create things out of thin air. Do not believe it. Everything that we have comes out of the ground or is grown on the ground. And that is then turned into goods. An important starting point for the production of electronics of all kinds is to have metals. Some of those metals need to be very specialized. In the capacitors, for example, you need metals that are not necessarily easily available in the world, but which can resist high temperatures and so forth. One of the most important of these metals is called coltan. Coltan comes from different parts of the world, but some 30 to 40% of it comes from that country in Central Africa, which some of you may recognize as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, when I say metal comes from that, you might imagine that what I mean by that is that huge pieces of equipment dig the metals out of the ground. An enormous amount of metal production in the world still has what is called artisanal production methods. That means that people literally chop it out of the ground with hammers and chisels and picks, or they pan for it, as gold prospectors panned for gold in the past. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, producing between 30 and 40% of the world's supply of coltan, you have around about 2 million artisanal miners. 2 million people getting the stuff from the surface of the ground using pans, water, hammers, chisels, and such like. And they include men, they include women, and they include children. This coltan then is exported, it's smelted, and it goes into the electronics industry, and it goes into every device in one form or another that we have that I've talked about. Now, obviously, the child doesn't earn a great deal, and the family doesn't earn a great deal, despite the fact that coltan is a very valuable mineral. But the problem is slightly worse than that, because some of you may also know that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a war zone, to such an extent that some people reckon it is the worst war zone in the world, far outrunning in terms of the number of deaths there, places like Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. Some of those people die as a result of the violence. Some of those people die indirectly as a result of the poverty, the malnutrition, and the disease that flourishes within those areas of violence. And the way the violence works is that armed groups like this need to find ways of getting the money for the weapons that they want. So the way they find to get that money is by taxing, effectively, coltan production. If you're an artisanal miner, you have to pay these people protection, or they simply take it from you. And then it's these people very often that sell on to the coltan into the global supply chain that then feeds into the electronic industries. So our child from Africa is actually important. Our child from Africa is one of 2 million people, who I suspect many of you probably didn't even know existed until I mentioned these 2 million people. But when we talk about a supply chain, we're talking about a chain of human relationships, and at the very root of that chain, in the artisanal mining industry of the Democratic Republic of Congo, is this very crude, very laborious process by which the wealth is hewed out of the ground, taken out of the ground, and then put into a system where it appears magically to re-emerge as something else. What does it re-emerge as? Now we need our Chinese woman. You'll see that she looks rather tired. She works for a company that a lot of people have also not heard about, whose name also doesn't appear in either of those two books that I have. It's called Hong Hai Precision Industry. I apologize if my Chinese is not correct in pronunciation. Most people have never heard of it. It is, in fact, one of the world's biggest companies. You may have heard of it by a slightly more familiar name called Foxconn. Foxconn employs over 1 million people. Foxconn makes almost every Apple product. It makes them in China, from which they are then exported to the rest of the world. It has several different plants in China. Much of the production initially took place in the Shenzhen area, in a part of Shenzhen that is popularly known as Foxconn City, where it's estimated 250,000 people work. 250,000 people. Officially, Apple only employs around about 60,000 people. But those are the people that work largely in the Apple stores, who are not paid particularly well, and the people working in the Apple headquarters. But behind the 60,000 Apple employees, in one city alone in China, there are maybe 250,000 people working, producing the Apple products that we're talking about. Now, our young lady's situation is much better than the Congolese child. It's actually much better than the situation of many other people in China, which is why lots of young women in particular, but also young men, struggle to get jobs in the Foxconn plants. But in the Foxconn plants, they suddenly find themselves in a different world, and in that world, they are forced to work very long hours. Most Foxconn plants work on a double shift of 2 12-hour shifts. There's an interesting question, therefore, about overtime. And the conditions there, although they're better than in a Bangladeshi textile plant, are nevertheless still, in our terms, not very good. One of the reasons that Foxconn hit the news a couple of years ago is that there was an epidemic of suicides. And as a demonstration of the kindness of Foxconn, in order to stop its workers committing suicide either at work or in the dormitories where they lived, Foxconn introduced suicide nets, so that when people threw themselves off, they wouldn't necessarily crash to the ground below. But there is something much more interesting. What is much more interesting is if you look at the statistics, you find something quite astonishing. And these statistics explain a little bit why the conditions of this young woman are not as good as you might think they would be, given that she's producing products that sell for so much in the West. And they also tell us something interesting about the limitations of the possibility of the growth of the Chinese economy. I'll say that again. They tell us something interesting about the limitations on the possibility of the growth of the Chinese economy. Because, of course, most people say there are no limitations. It can go on growing endlessly. What do those statistics tell us? They tell us something amazing. Only around about $10 of the value of an Apple product, iPhone, iPad, iPod, only around about $10, even of the more expensive ones, actually stays in China. Only $10. That has a double consequence. It means that, of course, it's not possible to pay that woman a great deal, but also, if you think about it, it means it's not going to be possible necessarily for the Chinese economy to grow fantastically fast, and to develop, because however many of these iPhones and iPods produces, only a small amount of the value is actually being trapped there. Some of you might find that puzzling. But one of the things that people don't appreciate is that what this woman does is not make any of those Apple products. All of the products that you have which say made in China, it's actually a lie. What it should say is assembled in China. A huge part of the value of the Apple products in terms of the components actually is imported into the Chinese economy from places like Korea, Japan, Europe, and even the United States of America. What most people do when they look at China is look at China's exports, but they don't look at China's imports. Now, China's exports are growing fantastically fast, but so are China's imports growing fantastically fast. What is important is the value that is added in China, and the value that is added in China by the young women working for Foxconn, the assembly women, is actually quite modest. It's sufficient for Foxconn itself to make a lot of money, but interestingly, Foxconn is a Taiwanese company, not a Chinese company. So most of the profits go outside of China. But it's not necessarily sufficient to provide the huge volume of investment that would be necessary really for the Chinese economy to take off. So that much of this Apple functioning in Foxconn is actually taking place in special economic zones. And what we need to appreciate, therefore, is not only the human side of the supply chain, but also the way in which the supply chain works in a peculiar way, so that people who contribute an important part of the product don't necessarily generate the value element of that product, and therefore the labor and the profit that comes from their labor doesn't necessarily reside in the countries. It's not to be found in the Congo, but it's equally not to be found in the Chinese economy. Another witness. This witness has some sympathy with our African child, some sympathy with our Chinese woman worker. But he's very, very angry for a different reason. And the thing that makes him angry is what's actually happening to taxation in the global economy. And he perhaps works for an organization like the Tax Justice Network, which is a fantastic organization exploring what goes on in the global economy. His message, he says, is simple. Pay your taxes. We know about you, we know what you do, we know its scale, and we know how you do it. The business scholars may not care. The people at the bottom of your supply chain may not have the means to see what we see, but we do see. We see you exploiting every loophole you can. We see you pressuring legislators to work to your agenda. And this makes it all the more important that we tell the world and force them to notice the little matter of Brayburn Capital and Reno, Nevada, Baldwin Holdings and the British Virgin Islands, your Luxembourg tax dodge, and all the other ways in which you manipulate the system. It's very strange, because if I look in the 600 pages of Isaacson's book, not only is there no Africa, no Foxconn, there's nothing about taxation either. And that's kind of rather strange. Because if you begin to track down the story of taxation and multinational companies, it becomes very, very interesting. Now let me show you a picture. It's a picture that Apple would like you to see. It's a picture of Apple's corporate headquarters. This is Apple's corporate headquarters in California, in Silicon Valley at Cupertino. This is the real heart of the Apple operation. Except it's not. Let me show you a picture of Apple's corporate headquarters. Brayburn Capital. Remember I said about the apples? This is a Brayburn apple. Tastes very nice. That one doesn't. Brayburn Capital is the official headquarters of Apple. It's a fairly obscure office, as you can see. Not a bit like that one, but that is where Apple in law exists. In reality, Apple exists there. In law, it exists there. That office is in Reno, Nevada, not in California at all. The reason for this is that when you try to study tax havens in the world, people make a fundamental mistake. They think that tax havens are small island economies like Jersey, the Cayman Islands. They are there. We'll come to them in a minute. But before you get to them, you have to look at the internal tax havens, those that function in the world's advanced economies. You can get on a Virgin train, and there's 1 hour and 50 minutes down the road. People who are interested in the same kind of stuff that I'm interested in and look at things like money laundering reckon that 10% of all money laundering in the world goes through the City of London. It is a tax haven. We don't like to think of it that way, but it is effectively a tax haven. In the United States, the biggest tax haven is actually to be found in the state of Delaware. And the biggest single office is this one, 1209 Orange Road. This is the official legal headquarters of 200,000 American corporations, including, as you can see, American Airlines, General Motors, Coca-Cola, Kentucky Fried Chicken. That's where they are in law. That's where they are in terms of their accounts. Why? Because in Delaware, one of those 50 or so states of the United States, if you're a company in Delaware, you pay little or no taxation at all. Nevada, which is where Apple is, was trying to achieve exactly the same thing, and therefore Apple relocated to Brayburn Capital in Nevada in downtown Reno. And what's fascinating, if you look at the history of a company like Apple, is the immense creativity of what's gone on there. Now, when Isaacson talks about creativity, of course, he's talking about a technological creativity. He's talking about iPods, iPads. But there's another kind of creativity. There's creativity in your supply chain. There's creativity in your taxation patterns. Apple has probably led the way in creativity in financial accounting. The high-tech IT firms in the United States pay less in taxation, a lower rate of taxation than most of the old companies. You might think that the worst companies are Exxon and places companies like this, but in fact they actually cough up more taxes and a higher percentage of taxes than companies like Apple. How does it do it? It does it in some amazing ways. For example, if you download an iTunes, you download it from Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the big center of iTunes. Now, it's not, of course, is it? What it means is the payment is all routed through Luxembourg. In 2006, 2007, around about 40% of all Apple's global revenues was in Ireland. Now, at this point, the Irish were thinking, that's really, really great, because Ireland is a dynamic economy, isn't it? Was it really the case that Ireland was a dynamic economy? No, all that was happening was that Apple was routing through Ireland the processes, the funds, and so forth that it was generating. This was called the Irish tax dodge, to which it's then necessary to add another tax dodge. Now, I would dearly like to show you another apple, and I would like to show you a Baldwin apple. If you've not heard about a Baldwin apple is it's an American apple, apparently very popular in the United States, but much harder to get in Britain or Europe. But you may notice that not only have we got Braeburn Capital, we also have Baldwin Holdings. And Baldwin Holdings exists in the British Virgin Islands. If you're not sure where the British Virgin Islands are, they're there. Not much to them. But if you go to the British Virgin Islands, and I desperately hope the university will send me there to prove that this is the case. It took me a long time to track this down using Google. I do lots of really heavy research using Google, but I'd really like to do some first-hand research. In Road Town, there is P.O. Box 3340, and that is the headquarters of Baldwin Holdings. As far as we know, in 2011, when Steve Jobs died, Baldwin Holdings had $74 billion of assets. $74 billion of assets. It was, in fact, probably at that point, the world's biggest hedge fund. Now, 75% of all hedge funds are actually controlled from tax havens of one kind or another. But this was the biggest one because having extracted the money from low-tax centers like Nevada, Ireland, Luxembourg, Apple was then locating it off the shores of the United States, because if the money went back into the United States, particularly from the European and other operations, it would have to pay tax under American law. So one of the things they did was to accumulate a huge amount of resources, essentially in a P.O. box. You cannot keep $74 billion in a P.O. box. It's not big enough. What you need to do was invest it. We don't know, because the Virgin Islands, as with all tax havens, is what people call a secrecy jurisdiction. It's not only a tax haven in the sense you hide your money away, but it becomes very secretive. But we suspect, I say we, the people who have forensically looked at this, think that what is actually happening to that $74 billion is that it's actually being invested in speculation on the world food markets and on the world commodity markets. It's being recycled offshore in order to make more money, in order to accumulate it in places like this. And I'm kind of puzzled that there's nothing in the books about that, because it seems to me that requires a certain amount of talent. You may share my view, it's a misuse of talent, but it requires a certain amount of talent that in some senses is just as innovative, possibly more innovative, than producing a better music player or a better computer. We need another witness. This is a slightly different witness. I'm not sure whether I should really introduce this witness, because as an old man, I'm not really cool enough to be this kind of witness, but this is a geek, a computer hacker of one kind or another. Now, the interesting thing is, in one sense, there is quite a lot in here about computer hacking and geekiness, because one of the world's great geeks and computer hackers was none other than Steve Jobs and his mate, Steve Wozniak. The very first business that Jobs had with Wozniak was to produce a device which enabled them to telephone anywhere in the world for free, which they then sold until someone discovered what they were doing. And then they very quickly moved on to the next thing. So successful was this, apparently, that they even managed to put through a call in the early 1970s to the Pope in the Vatican, pretending to be Henry Kissinger, and almost got through. What that reflected was the fact that these were very boyish, young, enthusiastic people that didn't really think that the way forward was to obey the rules. They actually thought there was some virtue in breaking the rules. And the early history of Apple is essentially the history of a company which breaks the rules. Even the very name, Apple, you will know, was a name that some people thought they stole. Because there was actually a group in Britain called the Beatles, and they did actually have a company called Apple, and you might think that two companies can't have the same name, there might be some kind of problem there. Not only did they steal ideas like that, actually very many of the ideas that went into the Apple products were stolen, and they admitted that they were stolen. So, for example, the computer mouse, the idea of icons, they actually took from other companies. Jobs at one point criticized Bill Gates for the way in which Bill Gates and Microsoft, as Jobs saw it, was stealing things, and Bill Gates turned around to him and said in a public meeting, well, the problem, Steve, is you're a bit jealous. It's a bit like two burglars go to rob a house of a TV. You're cross because we got there ahead of you, but you wanted to rob it in exactly the same way. And there was very much in this 1970s, 1980s period, this idea that information technology should be a free thing. It was something that was there to create a much better world and not something that was necessarily there to make a small number of people very, very rich. In 1986, this resulted in something called the Hacker Manifesto. I haven't made this up, it's a real manifesto. So important that if you've ever watched the film The Social Network about Mark Zuckerberg, it appears in there as well as an expression of this almost, if you like, pirate phase, the Robin Hood phase of the development of the high-tech IT industry. What does our young hacker say in 1986? This is our world now, the world of the electron and the switch, the beauty of the bow, that's something in computing. We make use of a service already existing without paying for what could be dirt cheap if it wasn't run by profiteering gluttons. And you call us criminals. We explore and you call us criminals. We seek after knowledge and you call us criminals. We exist without skin color, without nationality, without religious bias, and you call us criminals. You build atomic bombs, you wage wars, you murder, you cheat, you lie. You try to make us believe it's for our own good, yet we're the criminals. Yes, I am a criminal. My crime is that of curiosity. My crime is that of judging people by what they say and think, not what they look like. My crime is that of outsmarting you, something that you will never forgive me for. I'm a hacker, and this is my manifesto. You may stop this individual, but you can't stop us all. After all, we're all alike. Forgive the youthful romanticism. It's the 1980s. The guy who wrote this was probably only 19 or 20. But nevertheless, behind that youthful romanticism, you can, I hope, see something that is actually quite inspiring. It's the idea that we can use new technology to make things much more widely available and effectively to make them available for free. That's the whole argument about new technology. It's reducing the price of everything. Knowledge should be free. Ways of doing things should be free. They should all be freely available. And remember, of course, that in the 1970s, to some extent, that was what Jobs and Wozniak and these other people involved in the computing revolution were doing. They were unashamedly borrowing other people's ideas and celebrating the fact. One of the comments that is made, one of the quotations that is used, is a quotation from Picasso, where Picasso actually says that the really great artists plagiarize everybody. What they do is synthesize everything. They plagiarize everybody. And what we should be doing is bringing everything together. It's a kind of Wikipedia idea. It's the idea of collective knowledge, of everybody bringing their expertise together. But when we move forward 20 years, we find something very strange. Not only is Apple a fantastic company in terms of arranging its supply chain, not only is it a fantastic company in terms of arranging its tax affairs, it is also now one of the world's most aggressive companies in defending its patents and defending its copyright in one form or another. To such an extent that it is continually trying to push the boundaries as to what is patentable. Now, this is a big problem because we live in a really weird world. Some of you might know that a year or so ago, Cadbury's, now owned by Kraft, managed to patent effectively a color. If you use the color of the chocolate, you now have to pay them because they own, not the color of the chocolate, the color of the wrapping, the mauve color. They now own that particular color. And what Apple has been trying to do, and all these companies have been trying to do, is to move into a world where they can enclose knowledge, much in the same way that 200 to 300 years ago, land was enclosed. Having enclosed the knowledge, they can then charge us for its use, or they can charge other people for its use, other companies for its use. What forms of knowledge? Well, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of the knowledge, but just to give you one of the most famous examples, those of you who've got an Apple product will know that you can move your fingers like this and make the screen go bigger and smaller and the icons go bigger and smaller. Some people liken that to a steering wheel in a car. Henry Ford did not patent the steering wheel. The steering wheel was there for everybody to use. But Apple and other companies are trying to patent what in effect are pieces of technology, ideas, pieces of software that really should be available for all and that possibly haven't even been produced by them in the first place, but have been bought up by them. How serious is this? It is fantastically serious. If you look at what's going on, particularly in the high-tech industry, you find that there is what people call a patent war going on. Now, I can't go into all the details of this patent war, but if you cast your eye to the very top, you'll see there Apple, and each of the arrows going backwards and forwards indicate the different patent battles that are now going on between Apple and other companies. And you'll see that although some companies are not battling with Apple, Apple appears to be battling with most of these. How significant is this? In 2010 and 2011, the last 2 years when Jobs was running Apple, the 2 years when it had the highest stock exchange evaluation in the world, where its revenues were absolutely astronomical, Apple was spending more on patent fights and lawyers than it was spending on research and development. That's how serious this is. It's involving a huge diversion of resources and a huge series of battles in order to create an ownership, not of land, but an ownership of ideas, an ownership of intellectual property in one form or another. To such an extent that now even conventional economists are beginning to argue that this is crazy. Now, normally, conventional economists like the idea of property, but there's a big problem here, because if you had the misfortune to study economics in 1967, even I did, and even though my maths wasn't particularly great, I did remember there's something called perfect competition. And I did have to recite that perfect competition had 5 essential requirements, one of which was perfect knowledge. If knowledge was not freely available to consumers, and if knowledge was not freely available to producers, then neither could make rationally efficient decisions. But here we are in a world where we have, if you like, the possibility of knowledge becoming ever more free, but the commercial ownership of knowledge now seems to be at the forefront of the development of the big IT companies, and not least Apple. This brings us to our final witness. Do you think we can maybe get, through the psychic app, the possibility of seeing Steve Jobs? Maybe we can actually call him up. It is a psychic app. Well, let's see what happens if we call him up. This is not so foolish an idea, because in the original story, not in the Rashomon film, but in the original short story, one of the witnesses is actually the murder victim himself. The murder victim comes through a medium in exactly the same way that Steve Jobs is going to come through a medium and tells us the story. I'm not so creative, I can think all these things up for myself. What's Steve Jobs going to tell us? It's not necessarily what we think he might want to tell us. Because having died and having been sent to this other place, he's now had the opportunity to reflect a little more on his life. And what's puzzling him is that, having got this perspective, he doesn't seem to have left the mark that he thought he might make. Now, one of the most famous comments that Jobs made was that he wanted to make a dent in the universe. That was how big an impact he wanted to make. And if you read the books, this is the impact that is claimed for this new technology revolution, that it is making a dent in the universe. His mark is there. It's bigger than those who comment on him, not least professors at the University of Wolverhampton. But the mark is not what he expected. I received adulation. I was a rock star CEO. But in the bigger history that I now see, I'm not spoken of in the same breath as those I compared myself with, or was compared with by others. I was not a Thomas Edison. Even less was I a Henry Ford. I did not define an era. No one writes of a pre-Jobs era. There is no pre-Apple era, nor will there be any talk in your future of a post-Appleism or a post-Jobsism. This is our message via the psychic app from Steve Jobs. Could it be true? Could it actually be the case that all that adulation, all that drive for acquisitions of smartphones, iPads, iPods, Apple Macs, all those things actually left an amazingly small mark on history? For many people, that's an heretical thought because we are told that we live in an economy which is more IT intensive than ever before, that is more knowledge intensive than ever before, in which these things are more important than ever before. So could it really be the case that you're listening to someone say, actually, they're not that important at all? Well, there's strong evidence to suggest that that reflection might actually have some merit in it. One of the interesting pieces of evidence is that it's very hard to see that the economy has sped up, or that innovation has sped up, or that productivity has sped up in the last 30 to 40 years because of these things. In fact, all the evidence is that it's slowed down. The IT revolution has accompanied a slower rate of advance in the richest countries, a slower rate of productivity growth, and no obvious increase in the rate of innovation. Why would that be? In 1987, one of America's most famous economists, Robert Solow, said that if you looked at the computer revolution was everywhere except in the statistics. You couldn't actually find evidence that you looked at your eyes, everyone was getting a computer, they were desperate to have it, but you looked at the evidence of the statistics, what was going on in the economy, where was it? Well, a lot of people said Solow had got it wrong because the statistics were wrong. So a whole generation went back and reworked the statistics looking for the missing computer revolution, and each time they looked, they came up with the same conclusion: it's not in the statistics. You can't actually find it having the dramatic impact that people imagine it to have. Then they began to think a little bit about why that was so, and they recognized that there are 2 or 3 important issues here, which we've lost perspective on. One of these issues is about the way in which technology changes incrementally, slowly. Now, it's certainly the case that with my smartphone, I can instantaneously contact someone, but I could instantaneously contact someone before. I just had to go to a phone box and phone them. 200 years ago, I couldn't instantaneously contact anybody. I'd have to get on a horse and gallop to find them, or run and find them. The jump from a situation where I have to go on a horse to contact someone and get a phone and a phone call to someone is a much bigger jump than the jump from the phone box to the iPhone. The jump from putting a message on a boat and sailing it across the Atlantic to the first transatlantic cable is a much bigger jump than the jump from the transatlantic cable to the fax, and the jump from the transatlantic to the cable to the fax is a bigger jump than the email jump in terms of world history. They are much, much bigger things. And of course, a lot of what's actually happened is that we sped up things. We do things much more quickly that we were already doing quite quickly in world historical terms in the first place. So that's one reason why we might think that Solow's argument is correct, and we might be skeptical, therefore, about all the attention that's devoted to the transformative impact of the information technology revolution. But there is a second reason, and it's brought up very nicely by another American economist called Robert Gordon, but also picking up on a guy in Britain called David Edgerton, and also a Korean economist called Ha-Joon Chang. And they say if you really want to think about what's important in terms of changing people's lives, then think about very basic things. And they make you an offer, and I want to make you an offer as well today. If you've got an iPhone in your pocket, I'd like you to consider whether or not you want me to steal it or smash your toilet. Now that's the choice. You don't have a third choice. I can either steal your iPhone or smash your toilet. That's the choice. Now I'm going to be sexist here, but it's actually quite an interesting argument, and I'm going to assume that most of the men in the audience don't do the washing, can't do the washing, don't even know how to turn the washing machine on. So women of the audience, you have a choice. I can come along and smash your washing machine so it never works, or I can take your iPhone. Which would you rather me do? Now, most people, I think, presented with this choice immediately begin to twig that there's something interesting going on there. What we're actually looking at here are really important innovations. Sewage systems, toilets, washing machines, these really do have a transformative impact on people's lives. If you don't have to stand at the sink washing for several hours, then you have the opportunity to do some amazing things. If you don't have to worry about where all the sewage is going to go, you can live a much better life, a much healthier life. And the iPhone doesn't actually make a great deal of contribution to your life in comparison to that. You can invert the argument if you like. One of the things that people are incredibly excited about at the moment is the transformative potential of new technology in Africa. if you look at what's going on in Africa, then literally every month, it seems, there are tens of millions of new people acquiring mobile phones. Africa is going to be transformed. Don't be so silly. What would transform Africa would be a decent sewage system, decent road systems, decent electricity systems. That would be what would be really transformative. Giving somebody in the middle of Africa a mobile phone, even if they can use it to communicate with the rest of the world, if it's going to take you 3 or 4 weeks to get your goods out, because the roads are so bad, there are bandits in the way, is not actually going to transform much of your life at all. And we finally then look at something quite interesting. Last year, O2 did a survey of what people were using their high-tech devices in their pockets for. And in terms of the argument that this is transformative in our life, it's actually quite interesting. 128 minutes a day was the average time spent by people using O2 smartphones on the O2 network. It's nearly 2 hours a day. Let's hope they're using that time productively. Except 24 minutes was, 24% was 24 minutes browsing the internet. That could be, maybe they were doing something really productive to change the world. Checking social networks. Facebook. Playing games. Listening to music. Making calls, 12 minutes. Checking and writing emails, that might be. Text messaging. How productive is that? Watching TV and films, reading books, taking photographs. Even better, O2 then asked, if as a consequence of acquiring your smartphone, what have you given up? And amazingly, some people said, we've given up having a wristwatch. As a result of having an iPhone, we no longer need a wristwatch. So that's an amazing advance, isn't it? Once I had a wristwatch, now I don't have a wristwatch. And other people said, I've given up having an alarm clock. My iPhone wakes me up in the morning. What an amazing technological advance. And other people said, I've given up having a camera. It's a camera for me. So you might see here that there's actually an interesting problem in terms of the evaluation and the hype and the publicity that goes around technologies, that their transformative impact is not necessarily what you imagine. So we've been on a journey. We've been on a journey in which we've had a number of witnesses coming to our Rashomon gate. What's the point of our journey? Wikipedia, an infallible source of knowledge, tells us that the Rashomon effect, and a lot of people do talk of the Rashomon effect, is the effect of subjectivity, of perception on recollection, by which observers of an event are able to produce substantially different but equally plausible accounts of it. And if you look, there's actually quite a lot of discussion of the Rashomon effect. Again, I've plagiarized, stolen the idea. There are Rashomon articles about the global crisis. There are Rashomon articles about ethnography, all sorts of different things, in which people recognize that there are different stories to be told. But then I think they make a big mistake. Because what a lot of people do at this point is to make the conclusion that if there are different stories to be told, then there is either no truth or there is a multiplicity of truths. Now, I have told you different stories, but I've told you these different stories because I want you to think about them and to come to some kind of conclusion about them. In fact, last year, we had an interesting deployment of the Rashomon effect. Do you remember this man? This is the man who was heavily involved in Plebgate, in which he claimed he asked policemen nicely to let him out. The policeman claimed he didn't ask them nicely, and a group of spectators also gave a view which was in fact different from either of those two accounts. Now, in defending Andrew Mitchell as he disappeared from the political scene, at least in the short term, our esteemed Secretary of State for Education, one Michael Grove, an intellectual, said, well, of course, it's the Rashomon effect, isn't it? And I thought, oh no, I'm going to give my lecture about the Rashomon effect and everyone will think I've stolen it from Michael Grove. What a disaster. But I hadn't, I'd already had this idea. But what he was essentially doing was suggesting that it's in the eye of the beholder. And a lot of people make the view that it is simply in the eye of the beholder. But I think that's actually a misunderstanding of what the film Rashomon was about, and also a misunderstanding of what the original short stories were about. Now, I don't claim to be a literary critic, but I think that what these stories and what the film is telling us is a number of important, interesting things. Firstly, they're telling us something about the complexity and ambiguity of the world. The world is a complex and ambiguous place. We still, however, I think, need to make a judgment about it. Lots of people ask Kurosawa who did the murder, and he never told anybody, because the whole point was that you had to decide yourself who was doing the murder. But you still had to decide, because somebody had died, something had happened. You still need to make a conclusion about this. But in order to make that conclusion, we need to bring our judgment to explore many different stories. Simply going along with one story is a very, very dangerous thing. And if I can add to that, by way of conclusion, two final things. When I think of my position in a business school, one of the things that's exciting about being in a business school is it does give you the opportunity to explore a multiplicity of different stories, because you're actually trying to engage with the detail. But it's also quite hard to do that because there's always pressure on you to tell the dominant story, to tell the Isaacson story. Now, my argument is that we can't wait in business schools for people to come to us with their stories. If we do wait, we will simply repeat the dominant story. We have to go out and find those stories. We have to go out and find the stories of the supply chains, find the stories of the tax avoidance and the tax evasions, find the stories of the patent battles, and bring them into the mainstream of what we do. And it's our job to use the skills that we have to do that, and to have the courage to follow those stories wherever they go. I recognize that's different, but the kind of business school that I have a vision of is a business school which is not for business, but is about business. And being about business, it has the courage to speak to everybody who has a relationship with business. Whether you be a businessman, a worker, a consumer, a child in Africa, a tax justice professor, somebody who's a computer hacker, or even the ghost of Steve Jobs. Thank you very much. Any questions? There is actually some hard work behind this. Yes, sorry.
I was very interested by your example about the statistics not reflecting the effect of computers on development. But I'm an engineer, and I am conscious that almost every machine, everything we do has been impacted by computers. And although, say a car is still a car, even if it's got more controls by computers, it has had a change. Now, could it simply be that the effect is so dispersed and diffuse that it can't be spotted in the way you are suggesting, i.e. you look at the graph of development and computer invented and bang, a jump. If the effect is very, very diffuse and gradual and very widely dispersed, all you would see is a possible change in the slope of the graph, which would be very difficult to attribute to any one event.
Okay. I think there are two responses to that question. I think the point that you make is the one that a number of people began to think might be the explanation. But the first is at the level of the overall economic data. Even in your terms, the graph hasn't gone like that, but it should have been moving up slowly. But in fact, the productivity graph, if anything, has been going the other way, the opposite way to it. Now, you could make a more complicated argument that were it not for the impact of computers, it would have gone even more like that. But I think there is a real difficulty there. But I think what the comment that you make misses is that, yes, it is clearly the case that computers are everywhere. But they're essentially doing very similar things to what was done in a slightly different way before. Now, there are always alternatives, and there is a wonderful book that develops an idea that everyone who, like me, studied economic history should have found themselves without needing this person to draw their attention to it. The book is called not The Shock of the New, but The Shock of the Old. And one of the points it makes is that, first of all, technological change is much more ambiguous than people imagine. Even in your engineering factories, you will have some very, very high-level technologies alongside some relatively crude ones. So the average needs to be taken into account. But even where you've got the very sophisticated technologies, they are still possibly making incremental gains rather than huge gains. And the gains may be being wasted away. One of the points that's frequently made in respect of cars, for example, is that although cars are much better engineered than they were in the past, and they've now got all these sophisticated computers in them and so forth, petrol consumption hasn't necessarily gone down because we've added all sorts of other things into them, like cooling systems and so forth. So the net result of this is not necessarily as great a change as we might imagine, and it can sometimes be very costly. I apologize for making a comment to you all that I made to someone when we were out there, but much to my wife's annoyance, we still have in our cellar my record collection, which I bought. I can't remember how much I bought these records for in the early 60s, but I was buying records until about 1980. Then I gave up buying records, and I moved to the next great technology, which was, of course, audio tapes. And there is a collection of audio tapes there too, including some audio tape players. And then I moved to the next great technology, which was CD players. And I've got a load of CD players, in part because, of course, you can't give them away to charities. We give CDs away to charity shops, but you can't give audio tapes away to charity shops. And now, of course, I've got my iPod, like everybody else. Now, what have I actually gained in the process? In the process, if you think of my record collection, it's a huge amount of capital that I've acquired. I've invested a huge amount of capital, which has then become redundant. So I then replace it with my cassette player and my cassettes, which is another huge capital expenditure, for a slight gain. I could now walk around carrying it. I then made the terrible mistake of beginning to get rid of that and buying the CD player on the idea that I could walk around with a CD player in my pocket, except if you remember, it didn't work that way. Because if you tried to walk around with a CD player in the pocket, they didn't work all that effectively. So at each time I'm investing a huge amount, and if I'm gaining anything, what I'm gaining is actually a small bit. It's a slight increase. Though in terms of my life, the records are now in the cellar. The tapes are now in the cellar. The CDs are going to the charity shops, and all there is a small iPod now on my shelf with all these things in it. So it looks as if my life has actually been transformed, but it's cost me a huge amount, and the transformation is actually quite diffuse and small. Not diffuse and big, but quite diffuse and small. But I do appreciate that this is the paradox, and a lot of people get very frustrated because they do say, well, we can see it everywhere. You surely, as an economist, must be able to show that it matters. But no one has yet succeeded in doing it. So, there's a gentleman there.
If Steve Jobs, if what he's done hasn't transformed, if that hasn't transformed life today, which is, he comes then to the psychic network and says these things, what is happening today then, in your opinion, which is transforming the world?
That's a really, really interesting question. One of the things I learned many years ago as a young economic historian was that you don't know. In the 1770s in Britain, there was something called the Annual Register. The Annual Register recorded all of the great events that was going on. So it recorded in the 1770s the American War of Independence. It recorded the coming and going of politicians. And it also recorded the great technological advances of the 1770s. The only problem was that when people looked at it, they were struck by the fact that nobody mentioned a certain James Watt. Nobody mentioned the steam engine. Nobody mentioned the Soho Works down the road in Birmingham. Because at that time, it didn't seem that that was the transformative technology. In fact, they were talking about transformative technology. The one I recall was a better way of storing grain, so there was rather less disease. Now, that may have been important in the time, but it's incredibly difficult for us living through the time to actually make the judgment of what is really going to be the transformative technology. And almost certainly it's not the things that people tell us it will be, because they can't know either. Everybody makes those claims. I would guess that there's probably some engineer somewhere who maybe is doing something that we've not thought of, that will have a really important impact on the way in which people's lives are lived. But that's not necessarily at the moment going to be the IT thing. The IT thing is more or less, I think, done. They can speed things up. The interesting thing about the patent, well, sorry, I should take a step back. The interesting thing about the IT industry is it's not, in fact, many people think it's highly research intensive. It's not highly research intensive at all. If you look at the figures, the research intensity of more traditional industries, more traditional forms of engineering is much higher than the IT industry. It's not a particularly research intensive industry, but the patent battles that are being fought seem to be diverting resources that could go into R&D, even in the IT industry, into possibly negative methods of deploying your resources. It's said in American business schools that companies go through 3 stages. The first stage is innovation and a free-for-all. If you're really at the head, you're innovating, you don't care about your competitors. 70s, Jobs didn't care about his competitors. They had something they wanted to do with a passion, and they knew they were better than everybody else and they were going to do it. When Jobs gets kicked out, in the mid-80s, they bring in an executive from Pepsi-Cola. And he's a marketing executive, and Jobs thinks he's going to keep Apple on the right lines, but then very quickly finds that he's squeezed out, and he comes to the conclusion that he's made a fundamental mistake. Because when a company moves from innovation and free-for-all to a dominance of marketing, it will slow down in its growth. But there's then, unfortunately, a third stage, and the third stage is when you throw out the innovation, you throw out the marketing managers, and you start employing the lawyers. Once you start employing the lawyers, you go to a no-growth situation. And in a sense, that patent battles that I've been describing, where so many resources are going into defending existing technologies, is an indication that wherever the answer lies to your question, it's not going to lie in IT. It's going to be somewhere else, but we don't know what that is, and I'm not going to pretend I do know what that is. Sorry, there's a gentleman here.
Before and just now, you were talking about the problems of derived from companies trying to capture the benefits of innovation through the use of patents and copyrights. However, it's often argued that by allowing companies to at least capture some of the benefits, it encourages them to make these innovations. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this?
I think that's untrue for a number of reasons. I think that it's untrue in the sense that if one looked at the evidence, the companies that were most active in acquiring copyrights would be the most innovative companies. Now, very often the companies that are the most active in acquiring copyrights are the companies that are buying them up. It's important to understand that. Apple has actually produced relatively few things itself. I mean, one of the interesting things in here, for example, in these books, as Jobs was dying, the big innovation was Siri, you know, the woman who speaks. And he wanted that to work. And the Apple engineers, according to the official story, were desperate to show him that it worked, but incredibly nervous because they knew he was a very brutal CEO. And he tested things. So one of the things he did was to ask it a question in front of an audience like this, and they all were very, very nervously waiting for what the machine would answer. And the machine comes out with an intelligent answer. It's worked, it's worked. Steve's satisfied, we can go ahead. Now, you might think, if you read the story of this episode towards the end of the life, that what is actually happening here is that Apple engineers are developing this new technology. If you read the story of the patent battles, you find 2 things were happening. Firstly, they bought in this technology from another company. So it wasn't Apple designed. The company they bought it from was effectively what was called a patent trolling company, which is to say that they had stolen it from another company by trying to impose a patent on that other company. The company that had done the hard work lacked the financial means to defend its patent, so therefore company A does the work, company B takes the credit, and company C, Apple, comes along and buys from company B and then incorporates it in the process. So the patent activity is not necessarily an indication that companies are doing the hard work. You could still nevertheless make the argument that it is the dream of people to get rich. But this is where it's interesting in respect of the computer geek. Because the computer geek's argument is that it's the dream not actually to get rich, but to make a difference in the world, and to make a difference in the world by doing something that you can do out of sheer joy. Now, I don't take all of this argument, I take much of this argument about the hacker manifesto with a pinch of salt. There's an element of utopianism in it. But nevertheless, I think there's also something very positive in it as well. I'm actually not dismissive of us creatively coming together. There is a real problem. In this university, I am judged by the quality of my research outputs. The quality of my research outputs, by and large, appear in journals that none of you will read, because even if they were brilliant research outputs, unless you're a member of the university, the only way you can read them is by paying something of the order of 20 to 30 pounds a time, because they are all privately owned. If, on the other hand, I try and make a contribution to the world by putting self out into the public domain, I don't get any credit for it. I often tell people, I come in on the train, as some people know, and I occasionally have articles in the Shropshire Star and so forth. I have never had anyone come up to me and say, I saw your article in this particular journal or that particular academic. Never in my, well, it's not strictly true, actually. In the early 1980s, I was debating at what was then Keele University with somebody from CND over how to get rid of nuclear missiles. We both wanted to get rid of nuclear missiles, but I wanted to get rid of them rather more than he did, I thought, in terms of a really creative response to getting rid of them. And he attacked me, and I attacked him, and then at the very end, he came up to me and he said, "Are you the Mike Haynes that wrote that article?" And that's the only time in my life that that's ever happened. Whereas I quite often get people coming up and say, you know, I heard you on the radio, I saw something you wrote in the paper. And that's something you give. Now, the argument is that knowledge above all things ought to be freely available. And the really peculiar thing from your point of view is that in all the thousands of years that human beings have lived on this planet, it's only been in the last 200 years that they have begun to try to enclose knowledge. Isaac Newton didn't do it. People in ancient Greece didn't do it. Jefferson, famously in America, argued against it. One of the most important people in the history of medicine in the 20th century, a man called Salk, who did with polio, was famously asked why he didn't patent the polio vaccine. And his argument was, I would as soon patent the sun. It's my gift to the world. So this argument that people are driven by this desire to acquire more, and they will be more productive if you give them all these material incentives, is something I think we need to question, and question very heavily, particularly in an industry where it's so easy for things to be exchanged freely. One more question.
Thanks for the fascinating lecture, Mike. This might be a subject of a second lecture, but would you like to give us a very short sort of compare and contrast with perhaps Microsoft and the Gates Foundation?
Right. I've just been struggling to get this to work because those horrible people at Microsoft keep changing everything on a basis in order to keep their companies going. Don't get me wrong. I have acquired a grudging respect for certain of the things that Steve Jobs did. I think in particular the fascination with simplicity, the fascination with doing things right, the fascination with perfection is tremendously, engaging and tremendously important. But it is an interesting issue as to how you compare Microsoft, Gates, and Apple, and I don't actually draw that much of a distinction between them. Now, in the computer community, at least until 2011, of course, that would have been heresy, because Gates was the evil empire. That's how they talked of him. And Apple was these with Luke Skywalker and all these things trying to defeat the evil empire. I think there's a real problem as to whether that's true in terms of technology, because they both seem to me to be doing the same things. I think it's also interestingly as to whether they were true in terms, whether it's true in terms of human beings. I don't have a great deal of time for Bill Gates, but let's be realistic. He's given away a lot of his money, which Apple didn't, and Steve Jobs didn't. They've been using it in ways that have probably been harming things much more than Microsoft, in terms of Bill Gates giving away through the Gates Foundation stuff that's going to deal with Africa and so forth. Plus also, I do think, one of the things I'm struggling to find, I desperately need to find this quote, so if anyone's got it, please let me have it. But about 5 or 6 years ago, Gates did take on this issue of Africa, and he did argue that what Africa needed above all was a decent infrastructure, a decent road system, a decent sewage system, a decent health system, a decent electricity system. And therefore people had to stop worrying about IT divisions, knowledge divisions, because those were really by the way, and those were quite misleading. And when I find that quotation, I'm going to use it, and hopefully what I've talked to you about tonight will eventually be submitted for publication, and that quotation will be there, because it seems to me to grasp something really important about what transforms the world. And to that extent, although he may be the embodiment of the evil empire, I also warm to elements of him as well. I think he has an insight perhaps that's rather greater than Steve Jobs in terms of what the world needs. Sorry, we've got two questions, and then I think...
You, or perhaps witnesses 2 or 3, revealed the nonsense of a so-called virtual or weightless economy. Real work and highly exploited labour is at the root of this, whether in Africa producing the raw materials or in China producing the chips and the crucial bits of the thing. I think you said an average of around $10 of every Apple gadget actually found its way back to the Chinese economy, and I suspect a very small part of that to the Chinese labour. That, though, perhaps begs an interesting question, because though people in that position in the economy in Europe over time have, and in fact more recently in Korea and other places, have used their strategic power as workers to get a much better deal. And perhaps it's not quite the centre of the story you've been telling, but I think it's quite important. What chances do you see of that beginning to alter the terms of this deal, of changing the story? What chance of African workers and Chinese workers organising?
Well, that's a really difficult question to answer in a short space of time. I don't think I can really take on the African situation because, in part, as I said, these are artisanal labourers, and it's going to be very, very difficult for them to do it, particularly in the context of a war zone. The Foxconn workers are much more interesting. I should say to you that to all of you, that part of the response to Apple to this emerging story that I've drawn on here has been to try to present itself as being a much more socially responsible company. But the way in which it has done this has not necessarily found it many friends amongst those people who believe in corporate social responsibility, because it's tried to hedge its bets. Initially, it tried to have its factories audited by Apple in-house. Now it has external auditing, but the external auditing it has chosen are people who are expert at auditing clothing factories. In other words, it didn't go for the people who had expert auditing skills. These are NGOs in the area, but people who might not necessarily know what was going on. But what this reflects is the idea that you have here the possibility of a top-down solution, that if we can actually only bring better conditions, then we've got a win-win situation for everybody. The evidence that is actually available to us tends to come from much more bottom-up organizations that are interested in organizing. It's very, very hard to find out what's going on, because in particular in Foxconn City, you have not only the staff living in, or a significant section of the staff living in dormitories, but it's effectively a walled city. It's a guarded city. But there are conflicts going on there, and one of the most peculiar things I think about China is the extent to which there is this discontent bubbling up on what appears to be quite a massive scale. The Chinese state is playing quite a clever role economically, but also quite a clever role politically, because the Chinese state, on the one hand, creates these special economic zones in which this exploitation could take place, but then also says, well, it's not really our problem, we're not really creating those problems, it's those hard-hearted Taiwanese or those hard-hearted Americans. So it both creates it and then tries to detach itself from it, and that in a sense gives it the ability to play around with the discontent that is taking place. But one of the peculiarities of China at the moment, I think, is it's a really exciting place because there's actually so much openness. It sounds a strange thing to say, but not only, you can even find out Chinese strike statistics. They may not be the most accurate strike statistics in the world. They're not called strike statistics, but they're recording all of these things. Westerners can go in and interview people if the universities and the other organizations give them the money and the assistance. And obviously, you're in a situation, I think, where you have something that is very, very similar to what has happened before. I was a historian of Russia for many years, and therefore I'm very familiar with the way in which before 1914, in Russia, you had a concentration of large numbers of workers in desperate situations. And I was a few years ago at a conference where someone was talking about the dormitories that you saw. and was saying, this is really, really strange. All these workers living in big, big dormitories that are actually created by the employers so they can be easily available, but the employers can also keep an eye on them. And I said, there's absolutely nothing strange about that at all. I can point to exactly that situation in St. Petersburg in 1910. There were factories where workers lived in dormitories. And whilst at the one level they created the possibility of policing, so they also created the possibility of people coming together. Now, the interesting issue is how you come together, and I haven't had time to talk about this, but of course, almost all of these women workers are migrant workers. So that means that they are in a relatively weak position. It also means that they've got to overcome the fact that they're coming from different parts of China. So there's going to be a learning process, but the idea that you can always keep them down, it's something I think which is very doubtful. But it's something they're going to have to find for themselves. I think there are elements of them beginning to do that, but it might be a little while. Sorry, up the back, yeah.
Hi, I wonder, could you comment perhaps on the myth of the entrepreneur as the great white male? We've had comments about wives and mothers and a brief mention of washing machines tonight. And I think what's very interesting about all the questions is that they're all predicated basically on the myth of the great white entrepreneur, the great white Western entrepreneur. And related to that, do you think you're actually, even though you're being incredibly critical about Apple and about Jobs' legacy, do you think you're actually just adding to the myth of Jobs by focusing on him in this
the
way?
great white male. I don't know. Well, that's for me to cop out at this point and say you're to draw, you're to draw those conclusions. Oh, please don't get me started on the myth of entrepreneurship. One of the most difficult parts of being in a business school, in a knowledge-seeking university, is that you have to follow a certain official language. And that official language for the last 20 to 30 years has been the language of entrepreneurialism. Now, I don't actually understand much of the content of this, because when I look in the statistics, and I love looking in the statistics, I can't actually find the evidence for this massive entrepreneurial surge that people talk about. There's clearly elements of entrepreneurialism going on, and they are both male and female. There's a big argument about, female are increasing, but we need even more. But it's not clear to me that the British economy or the global economy in 2013 is more entrepreneurial than it was in 1900. In fact, I think in many respects it's much less entrepreneurial. It then gets even more difficult because we're in a situation where, and I'm grateful for my students who've come from many different parts of the world, including Africa, where one of the things that we have to pass on to people in the poorer countries is our expertise in entrepreneurial behavior, how you can survive as an entrepreneur, how you can set up small businesses. And I'm deeply, deeply embarrassed by that, because anybody who lives in a poor country can only survive by being incredibly entrepreneurial. We shouldn't be telling them what entrepreneurship is. They live entrepreneurship, every day. Even if you've only seen Slumdog Millionaire, and I know it's romanticized, but the little boy who collects bottles and tries to survive by creating a small business, that's a kind of real entrepreneurialism. And I think there's this huge myth, and entrepreneurialism, whether it be the great white woman or the great white male, is essentially a rhetorical thing that is deployed by the government and deployed by the universities. If you actually look at the evidence, then the evidence seems to be fairly clear that most business is big business. It continues to be big business. It will always continue to be big business. And I think there's also a failure to address the false romance of small business. A lot of people argue, I'll be personal at this point, a lot of people ask me, you're obviously radical, why are you in a business school? And you give various excuses, and I've stopped in a sense giving excuses because I actually grew up in an entrepreneurial family. Now, my father was a carpenter who worked for somebody, then set up his own business, ran his own shop. They worked all hours under the sun, and it was hell. It was hell for them, it was hell for me. Everybody, in a sense, suffered. Now, at the end of the day, they didn't do badly out of it. They arrived, they got their shop, they sold it, they got their pension. But it was misery. It was work, slaving, hour after hour. In Northamptonshire, every week they had a van. They would drive up the motorway to Birmingham, to what the big warehouses, which no longer, some of them still exist, and they would buy stuff and they would take it back, and every week, week after week, they would do this. It was not all that it was cracked up to be. And of course, part of the problem with the great myth of entrepreneurialism is that when you talk to people who want to become entrepreneurs, there's actually a tiny number that want to become like Alan Sugar. Most people want to become entrepreneurs, most small people, because they want to opt out of the rat race. You know, you see them in twee places like Shrewsbury and places like that. I want to have my own life back. Sadly, they don't necessarily get it because of the sheer hell of actually running a small business. I would never want to do it myself because I grew up in a home where that was, in a sense, 24-hour thing. So I have both an emotional resistance to that as well as an intellectual resistance to that argument. But it's very hard sometimes in a business school which has this entrepreneurial rhetoric. Right. Sorry, one last question, I think. You're not paying me for this.
Oh, right, okay, thank you. The local newspaper was founded by Carnegie as well, and look what happened to that. Yeah, it was founded as a radical home rule and free trade paper. You've basically described an industry which is into financial innovation and legal innovation with the technical side as a fairly small part. But if all these hedge funds are offshore, and I noticed Apple this week announced that it was raising money on the debt market to buy shares back to inflate the share price, rather than bring onshore the $135 billion it now has offshore. Does that deform capitalism in a sense that all this money is affecting the market, sucking liquidity away from the capital markets, and can never be brought onshore unless they want to pay their taxes? Do they have a strategy for bringing it onshore at some point? And if it's not coming onshore ever, why do they do it? Is there a raison d'etre to this anymore?
Right. The argument about defamation is, I think, a really important one. I've been raging for years about the fact that we now live in a corrupt system. And when I first began to make this argument 10 years or so ago, several things happened. My best reject article was one where the reviewer said, "We've read all of this in private eye." And I thought, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be in the academic world. We've read it all in private eye. But there was this sense that corruption was on the margins of the system. The defamation was on the margins of the system. And therefore, that anybody who was interested in raising these issues should be raising them in a journalistic way, rather than raising them in a more theoretical way. Now, I think there is a theoretical way in which we can raise it, and actually it's one that surprisingly has been raised in the conventional sphere as well as the radical sphere, perhaps more in the conventional sphere. What we're looking at is what conventional economists would call a rent-seeking economy. An economy in which a small amount of profit is being made, and then everyone fights over who gets it, and tries to devise different and ever more innovative ways of getting that and inflating it. And it seems to me that, as you said, a lot of the effort has now gone into financial engineering, and we know the consequences of that. But we're not necessarily prepared to think this through. Now, let me give you some basic statistics. I have the good fortune, in one sense, to teach people about the world economy. I can talk, for example, about the British economy. I can talk about the French economy. I can talk about the American economy. I can talk about foreign investment. And then I have to address the fact that a quarter of all world assets are based in tax havens. A quarter of all world assets are based in tax havens. 50% of international trade goes through tax havens. Not just your Apple computer, but every banana that you consume has passed, in theory, it doesn't actually go to the tax haven, but it goes through the tax haven. And then I have to tell people about the rationality of the system. I have to look at the foreign investment statistics, and I have to try to explain why is it the second or third biggest investor in China is the Virgin Islands. Why the second or third biggest investor in India is Mauritius. There's, I think, someone here from Mauritius. I apologize for insulting Mauritius. But the second or third biggest investor is Mauritius. You have to look at the Irish economy and look at the Irish economy in 2007, 2008 and say, wow, the Celtic tiger. And then a year later, it disappeared because it was all a fantasy. You have to look at Cyprus. Cyprus is one of the biggest investors in Russia. There are people here from the Baltic states, which are huge investors in Russia. Why? because the dirty money comes out and the dirty money flows back. Now, whereas 50 to 60 years ago, these were things that were happening on the margins of the system, I now think they're coming much more to the center of the system. So insofar as I have any life left in me, then one of the things I want to do is partly describe that, and I make no apology for saying that facts are important, to partly describe it, we need to know more about that, but partly also to try and think theoretically about what is going on and how we've moved into a much more degenerate phase, effectively, of rent-seeking, corrupt capitalism, in a way which existed maybe 200 years ago, in what some people called old corruption in the 17th, 18th centuries, but which to some extent disappeared, but has now returned very, very strongly in the late 20th, beginning of the 21st century. Okay, thank you.